On my first day at the job at Harvard, I was asked to make a rather impromptu speech, and so I opened to any page in the one book I had carried with me that day, knowing that no matter what poem I landed upon, it would yield something worthy of my new beginning and of the people who had assembled to celebrate the art form to which we had dedicated our lives. The poem I read that day begins, "Sympathy, coincidence, that the meaning of the word here contains the meaning of oneself. And I am, as I've written somewhere, glad to be here." Or as I quoted Mary O saying when I read to her Rilke's "The animals and the insects stare at the open. Therefore," said Mary, "they are welcome." Tonight it is my great professional privilege and personal honor to extend to you the gesture that seems to have characterized the lives and work of George and Mary Oppen, this continuous intimation of welcome, of openness and capital O, Oppenness, not merely to others, but to the elected adventure before them. As Heidegger writes, the poet goes with the venture. The Oral History Initiative was founded as a way to involve the public in a series of informal conversations between friends, family, colleagues, and students of pivotal poets of the 20th century. The idea came from the kinds of anecdotes that I began to hear when visitors such as yourselves would enter the poetry room. These alternately poignant, quirky, and confounding stories were ones that I began to feel responsible for, not being the kinds of stories that one always finds in official biographies or academic theses, but tender and intimate and idiosyncratic, the very nebulous moments that form and inform a life. And so the Poetry Room began to record and collect them in what I hope will contribute to a cumulative mosaic of 20th century moments. One that does not seek to shroud the, quote, sacred individual, but rather believes, as Oppen writes, in the benevolence of the real. Tonight's oral history focuses on a poet whose work has been an ethical signpost in the sea for me, whose humane poems and letters have always managed, even in the darkest reaches, as he writes in the passage in your program tonight, to find me. To return that metaphysical favor tonight, I've asked poet and Oppen scholar Patrick Pritchett to briefly introduce you to Oppen's life and to facilitate the conversation amongst our esteemed guests this evening. Please welcome Patrick Pritchett.
Thanks, everyone. It's great to be here, and I want to thank Christina for organizing this. Tonight we'll be talking about the life of George Oppen. The arc of his career, which I'll sketch out briefly here, but I'm sure you're all familiar with already, travels one of the most remarkable trajectories of any American poet. Born in 1908 in New Rochelle, New York, and you can check me on this as we go, okay? Keep me honest. He published his first book, Discrete Series, in 1934 as part of the Objectivist publishing collective he co-founded with Louis Zukowski. Responding to the disaster of the Great Depression, he abjured writing poems and would not, in fact, write again until 1958. Instead, he and his wife, Mary, joined the Communist Party and worked in emergency relief and union organizing for the rest of the decade. If this is sounding familiar, to current events, well, I prompt you to engage in some dialectical reflection. Drafted into the Army in 1942, he saw frontline combat in the European theater where he was severely wounded by German fire. He sustained himself in a foxhole, as he later recounts in Myth of the Blaze, with the poems of Thomas Wyatt and his good friend Charles Reznikoff. After the war, harassed by the FBI for his political beliefs, he fled to Mexico with his family, where he lived in exile until 1960. Back in the US then, first in Brooklyn, then later in San Francisco, the books began to appear, the materials, in 1962. This in Which, 1964, and in 1968, Of Being Numerous, which was awarded the Pulitzer Prize. George Oppen went on to publish 3 more books, Seascape, Needle's Eye, Myth of the Blaze, which is sort of folded into the first collected, and Primitive, which appeared in 1978. He kept up a significant correspondence with friends, family, and poets, and spent summers sailing in Penobscot Bay. In 1984, suffering from Alzheimer's, George Oppen died at the age of 76. His life was extraordinary for its courageousness and his unyielding commitment to principle. His ragged itinerary offers us another way to understand his most famous lines. Obsessed, bewildered by the shipwreck of the singular, we have chosen the meaning of being numerous. To make such a choice means forsaking certain comforts, certain sureties. It means hewing to a line of austere devotion, rejecting mere reportage, each word of the poem staked to the wager on clarity, the desire to know the world as it actually is. I have not, he writes en route, and never did have any motive of poetry but to achieve clarity. We're very fortunate to have with us tonight some family and friends of George Oppen, the poet's daughter, Linda Oppen, Rachel Blau du Plessis, who has edited his selected letters and written at length about both his work and his role as her mentor, and Bob and Helene Quinn from Eagle Island, Maine, where the Oppens spent many a summer. George Oppen meant many things to many people. He was a poet, an activist, a sailor, and a father. So we're going to spend the next hour here asking our distinguished panelists to share their memories of him, and then we'll open it up to the audience so you can share your questions and stories. I thought we'd just start sort of on a common ground here and talk about something that was really central to George Oppen's life, which is his love of sailing. And I wonder, maybe Linda, we'll start with you. Maybe you could, tell us a little about that. What's a memory of sailing?
Well, his first boat, it's not my memory, but he got his first boat as promised when he could swim all the way around his father's boat in the harbor in Long Island Sound, and he was about 6 or 7, and indeed was given a boat. And there is a picture, I don't know if it still exists, but I've seen it, of a little rowboat, and like a child's drawing of a triangular sail, and a boy and a dog. And it was the dog, Billy, an Airedale, who I think swam with him around the boat. And he sailed from then on, and to the best of my knowledge, never willingly swam again.
A sailor who didn't swim.
Well, but that was a point of honor to not get wet.
But Rachel, you and your husband Bob, who's with us tonight in the audience, you guys went sailing with him?
Yes, we did,
Maine?
and in Maine. Yeah. And I was not the type whose father gave her a boat after I barely learned to swim later in life, but it was a really extraordinary experience to sail with them because the boat was tiny. Mm-hmm. What was it, a 15 feet? Day sailor. I mean, these are words I don't truly understand, but although I'm speaking them. And it was just about as big as we are here. Mm-hmm. And Mary and he were brilliant sailors. Mm-hmm. He once, they got out of the boat into a little kayak to bring us back to shore, and I have to say that I was the last out. They took Bob over first, and I'm like, okay, well, I'm in this boat now by myself, and I guess I'm going to get into that little kayak. I was a bit, but the thing that I really remember that was so moving to me and still very moving is at one point, and this is highly symbolic of my relationship, my assumed relationship with him. He gave me the tiller, and I had never sailed, and I didn't understand that the sea was that strong, and that there's something about that, George doing that, but then my understanding what he was doing, that was very significant to me.
Bob, what do you remember about him? You kept a sailboat for him. You've lived on the sea your whole life as a lobster man. Where would you rate his seamanship?
But I never sailed. And unlike George, I don't know why that is, but I have. I came to Eagle Island when I was 2 weeks old, because by boat, and I left the day before yesterday by boat. All the time in between, but I've never. My only sailing act, let's say, certainly my first was with George and Mary, and it was interesting in that they finally coaxed me into going out. Probably, I think Helene was with us as well, but in that little O'Day was the make of the boat, sailboat, that they sailed all over the coast in. And we got underway and left from the float and sailed out, and George was, well, where would you like to go? And it dawned on me that all the time I've been in the boat, I always had some place to go, be it from one lobster trap to the other, or from the island to shore or back again. But I couldn't ever think of having been
For fun.
in a boat, and I didn't know where to go, and sitting down beside. But yeah, we did sail. We sailed around just a little bit and back. But you know, the thing that first amazed me about George and sailing, I had a lot of people get, you know, sailboats. My uncle wrote comical verse about things, and one of his lines about sailing was that they'd sail 10 miles in 4 directions and accomplish only one. Well, George, he would sail from the beach where the camp that they rented around to the main dock to pick up their mail. And he would come in with that sailboat and just swing around, head up into the wind, and back up to the float.
Yeah, he was amazing.
That's
That was
amazing.
pretty amazing to me.
I'm trying to work out a theory of, you know, sailing, some kind of, you know, poetics. You know, what's the influence of sailing on poetics? But
I think it's vectors, actually.
yeah, but Helene, do you remember any? Did you go out in the boat with them too, or?
Well, if I did with that one time with Bob, and I don't particularly recall, but I share the same sentiments with Bob. For us, boat is transportation, it's not
Right.
for pleasure. And inside of our home on Eagle, it's a little distracting, and I tell people, thank you very much for the offer to sail, but if it was off the coast of Greece, I would probably go for it. Off the coast of Eagle Island, all I can see is stuff to be done.
Yeah. Point taken. Yes. I thought maybe Linda, you could, you know, tell us some favorite memories of growing up. You know, maybe in Mexico or.
Okay, but just the sailing makes
Yeah,
me
right,
think
yeah.
the sailing was so important to them, and it was so essential to their sense of power and knowledge and reckless adventure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it was a part of their lives always, except in Mexico. It's the only time when we didn't live, they did not live at the coast. And I've wondered if Mexico had been on the coast, if he would have returned to poetry sooner.
Interesting.
That the sailing was the original combination life that they were creating. It had a way of being their own life over which they had total control, and not that period.
Right, and that kind of speaks to their general commitment to kind of nomadic life. I mean, nomadic is one way of putting it. Power, knowledge is another way, right? I mean, right after when he comes back from World War II, he builds the trailer. I mean, could you tell us something about the trailer and, you know, what you guys did, your crazy adventures?
Well, he came back very wounded, and my memories of, I have earlier memories, but his return from the Army, I knew he was going to return, and when finally he did, and this was delayed through various, so it must have been a long time expecting him to come home, and he finally came home, and I had last seen him in uniform, a young, in-training, striding person. And this was sort of a shadow who came in and was helped, or I'm adding in memories, to a darkened bedroom, and the house was kept dark, and the people we'd lived with were moved out, and there was silence. He was deaf, He was still recovering. This was months after being released from the hospital.
Right.
His hearing recovered. If you whispered, that was okay. I was 5 when he returned. So it was a long, precarious, fragile start. And apparently they decided we were going to move to California, and he brought home, or found, or had originally, a tiny little carrier, just pulled behind, carrying wood or something behind a car. And this was parked in front of the house, and he started building a front end to it. And it was done for a little camp stove, a little pump-up gas system. And the edges around the back were done in so that they could sleep kitty corner, and I was to sleep in the back of the car, and the car was bought. But I do remember, and this sense of his making and being a person and recovering, it was building this object we were going to live in. And it was a sensation on the street if people hadn't had any idea you could build or drive or pull this across the Rockies, or there was much discussion going on. But I was very proudly part of this, and I was asked what color to paint. And the reason I remember it was I was very proud of the word turquoise, and that it was the color I wanted, and that I could say it. So we had a turquoise. We had a turquoise cooking shelf, and I think maybe the rest of the trailer was turquoise.
That's fantastic, and that does seem like that. I mean, this helps, I think about his poetry, and also about building a shelter in words, right, as well as recovering from the traumatic
or maybe
events of the war.
declaring something a shelter, even if it wasn't adequately a shelter.
Yeah. That works.
But also, I mean, in a way, I know from the letters that he felt sort of a lot of residual guilt afterwards, because he was overage when he was drafted, and he kind of put himself in the way of the draft, tracking this. So, and then he was very badly wounded, as you've said. And the recovery is in part a kind of guilt at putting you and Mary in such straits as that he might not have come back, which, I suppose when you're there, you think you're there, but he could have, in fact, died. And I've always, there's just a shadow, there's a kind of sadness around that choice, which was very much a principled anti-fascist choice when he went to war. Do you have any?
Well, one of my mother told me, I think she may have written about this, but it was a story I certainly knew well. Part of their extraordinary marriage, and it was as romantic and charismatic as it seems, but part of it was promises were sacred, they were total. They weren't made often, they weren't asked for often. But one promise was, you will not volunteer for anything in the Army. You will not put yourself in further danger, having gone into the Army. And I think that was sustaining for him. It was a line that he couldn't cross.
Right, under the pressure of the moment, or the...
Well, he was always volunteering or saying, yes, let's, or what a grand idea, or we'll think about this later and do it now.
Shoot first, aim later.
So that I think her strength and her limits brought him through, and I think they thought this. There was that their solidarity and their strength, even with their separation, was part of the war experience.
So I'm wondering then how did that play out in terms of the decision to move to Mexico? I mean, there's the well-known or fairly well-known story about, the FBI comes to the house in Redondo Beach, and your father tells them where to get off, in so many words. But they thought this through, right? Can you talk a little bit about this, what that was like going there?
I was blamed for a lot of things, including that.
Yes, including that. Yes, that's right. That's actually right.
that he would, again, principled, go to jail and it would only be a year. But he couldn't do it for the child, me.
Right.
So the decision to go to Mexico was to avoid jail, which they thought was very likely, because he wouldn't name names and they'd be called up before HUAC.
There was an eerie thing. I'm sorry if I'm
No,
interrupting, but there
no.
was a very eerie thing that they talked about the possibility of people being put in camps. I mean, actually, J. Edgar Hoover had this kind of mania about Reds, and there was this rumor around. Apparently, they talked that they would be in habeas corpus would be denied, and that everybody there'd be a roundup. And when I heard this, I don't know that much about the history of that period, and I was taking it from them, in effect. Last summer or 2 summers ago, there was a release of information out of the U.S. government that said that actually Hoover had a list of 20,000 subversives, quote unquote, who would be declared, they would be put in army camps, actually. And it was absolutely uncanny to see that someone was clearly leaking this information, and there was a kind of panic around that. But that Hoover, who was apparently stopped by Truman, who didn't want any part of this, it was ridiculous kind of stuff. Nonetheless, the people who could have potentially been affected did, think that they should perhaps leave the U.S. And that was an interesting confirmation for me of this terrible moment when decisions were made and...
Yeah.
Those
were the rumors, those were the thoughts. The communist people all repeated to each other endlessly, even the paranoids have enemies.
Right.
Because these stories were real, and you didn't know one from another.
The Communist Party was legal in this country up to a certain point, which can be looked up, and it was people were engaged in legal political activity at the time that, say, George and Mary were organizing, at the time when anything, and it raises the question, what kind of a communist was George anyway? Which would be, I would put, if anybody has any thoughts about that.
Well, one of the most important to me dates for them was his doing a great deal of conniving and contriving to be drafted into the Second World War, which, if he had been a good communist, he would have not been doing. There was the Hitler-Stalin pact, and communists were to be neutral or something. That was a turning point for them, and they remained Marxists absolutely the rest of their lives and remained within social circles of communism, but adamantly, to whatever degree they might have had any larger communist loyalties or international readings or meetings, ended. He did the exact opposite. He volunteered for this war that the communists were saying you must not enter. And his allegiance was as a Jew and as a danger to the U.S., and he acted. It was another one of his switches from one activity to another activity, and total commitment. He went into the army.
Yeah, it's so interesting. That's like an existential choice. They did a lot of that. In my view, that is, there would be, with that switch that you're describing, they decide, and then from that moment on, this is true, which absolutely fascinates me. There was, as if there was no backwash from those kinds of things.
Not to them.
Not to them. But to other people.
There was a wake that went out behind.
But I mean, it's really like they lived an existential choice in a strange way.
Well, Mary titled her book Meaning a Life, and she meant the meaning intended a life. She could have called it, if it hadn't been used, discrete series. One thing to another thing to another thing, and this was how they lived, by choice and in fact.
Well, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about, George's relationship to Jewishness, because it doesn't, my sense of it has always been that it doesn't become really that pronounced until after the war, and yet he felt, he had a sort of troubled or, ambivalent, he had the classic Jewish relationship to Jewishness. It's very ambivalent, right? So, I mean, did this get talked about, and what did your mother think?
Well, they've told the story that when they met, obviously very attracted to each other, but the moment of meeting, he said, thinking this might sort of end it, said, well, you know, I'm a Jew. And she, never having met a Jew, but having read the Bible, thought, the chosen people. This is good, and proceeded. And I think he made this statement and identification because his terrible problems with his stepmother, who was Jewish but went to the Episcopal Church and tried to do everything she could to assimilate or be separate. Mm-hmm. But his mother, who had committed suicide when he was 4, and it is through the mother you become Jewish, I think this was his statement or his way of saying, I'm not what my father has married. I'm not the step family. I am my mother's son.
Reclaiming something original to him.
And he probably knew very, very little about what it was. They were very assimilated.
Right.
Right. I mean, his parents were married in the ethical culture ceremonies. You know, it was totally un-Jewish. Mm-hmm. But when they were, and they've written and told stories of when they were in Europe and heard about the persecution of the Jews, this became, and just before the war, and when they were in Italy and they could see the Jews pouring into France. What is a Jew and I'm a Jew, and what does this mean? And so.
Yeah, apparently
that was an exploration.
I once asked maybe it was you I asked finally, was he ever a bar mitzvah? And apparently he wasn't. And at a certain point late in life he said, well, we went into a synagogue to see what it was like. I mean, as if he'd never been in a synagogue. Which is absolutely,
that's valid.
But I have to read something from the letters because this is part of also what the level of wit that Oppen had, which was unbelievable. And it's to my great pain that I don't remember some of the incredibly, he's so droll and so funny. Okay, this is way, it's actually, he was talking about one of his fellow leftists, and it's a letter to you actually, Linda, challenges me, what is a Jew? That is, this fellow leftist. I tell him solemnly, a Jew is what you and I are. Then I prove to him that I could cease to be a Jew only by lying. So I say, if I had to lie in order not to be a Jew, then I must really, etc., almost as a really tight philosophic proof.
Yeah, yeah.
And so that's what, you know,
I think
there were a number of identifications like that, but I don't think he knew what being a Jew was.
He had no experience of it
at all. You know, he didn't do anything that was particular. Yeah, they went to Israel, and that's a later, that was
right.
They had a terrible time.
I know.
I mean, what did he say about that? I mean, I know that it was not what he was.
It was such a
hoping
relief to leave, he said.
Yeah. And your mother writes the Jerusalem Journal, which I've read.
They found beauty there, and they found wonderful people there, but these weren't people they knew or fit in with or understood or who welcomed them or understood them particularly.
Well, I wonder if we could maybe go back to Mexico. We're just jumping around here, but you know, I mean, sailing was denied them. I mean, I wonder if you could tell us some memories about being in Mexico.
Well, I had a wonderful time in Mexico. I'm very, very glad I was there. It was a wonderful place to be young and be exploring, and it was meaningless to them because they did not intend. They hadn't chosen to go there. They couldn't choose to leave when and how and where they wanted to. And it's the only period in their life that wasn't self-determined, self-determining, and it was.
It killed them, right?
They had a terrible, terrible time. My father was still recovering from the Army wounds and the psychological. We now know about post-traumatic stress, but he always kept his back to the wall in any room he entered. Through all of those years, it was still there, and he was depressed an awful lot of the time. But their ability for friendship and commitment and doing things, we traveled beyond the roads, where oxen had to pull us out. We went up the mountains that didn't have people going to them. We went almost every state we visited.
Wow.
And this was pretty adventurous.
Yeah.
It still would be pretty adventurous, actually.
And going beyond where I had Spanish, they didn't, but we went beyond where Spanish was the language, and saw and entered in and explored. I'm so very glad for that. 10 years, or nearly 10 years. But they skip over it as a period that wasn't of interest to them.
They didn't on Eagle, though. Some of the funniest stories came to us from their experience in Mexico.
Well, yeah.
And about steering a pig around like a wheelbarrow to get it into a cart or something. Do you remember the details of that, Bob? Oh my gosh, we were in gales many times with some of the.
Why did this pig have to go into a car?
Well, there was a pony that had to go into a Cadillac. I remember that in the back. that was but I don't remember that the pig had. I don't know. What is your? You remember these stories better?
There's
than
also
I
a
do.
donkey had to get in the panel truck. That
There seems to be a
That
motif
tries
here.
it's a theme.
Well, he didn't know about animals, and was quite
You know, I'd have to say that
honest about
I
that.
hadn't remembered that. Now that you recall it, I do, but no more than that about some of those. And I was listening to this, thinking about all the conversations and the time we spent together with them, but I didn't remember a lot.
Yes,
I'm
not
trying
any
to
of
put it
these
in
stories.
sequence, how that is. I think a lot of what, they talked about times before that, I guess, when they traveled across the country, which goes back to the sailing, I don't know if you want to get back there, but he worked for a newspaper in New York City for a time, and they saved up $200. And immediately set out for Maine to buy a sailboat in Tennant's Harbor.
Is this when you first met them, or is this earlier?
Oh, this is a story George told about
Okay.
sometime much earlier than before
Okay.
the years they came there. And I think that would have certainly been before the war.
It was in the 20s, yeah.
That
you
was
say
much
something?
earlier on.
Yeah.
They were quite young.
Well, like what the North meant to them, because
Pardon?
what the North, Maine, northern New England, what that meant to them, because it did, and this is a little bit in contrast to Mexico.
Right.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
did you have I mean, whether they said anything about it, did you have a sense of what that was?
A sense of being
I would-
in Maine,
Like
or in
what-
contrast to Mexico.
No, just as particularly the sense of being in Maine and northern
Oh.
New England, like what that meant, the nature of the land, or the nature of people there, or the nature of, because he talks about it in the letters, and I mean, it's one thing for him to be talking about it in the letters, it's another thing.
Yeah, and
Does
I
it
thought it was
anything
all
strike
about
you?
sailing.
I think
Yeah,
It's
it was the
about
sailing.
about
Okay, back
sailing, but it was Maine specifically. You didn't see them elsewhere.
No, and
so
that's
you-
what I'm struck by with this conversation, because I feel like I know very little of George and Mary in the way that you're discussing their lives.
But on
But-
the other hand,
The undertone, perhaps, but we didn't talk about that. We were just, entertaining ourselves with. There was, these kind of deep philosophical conversations while I was stuffing chicken to go in the oven, and it all worked hilariously. I mean, we were we were so entertained by them, and so caught up with their sense of the universe and just their being. But we laughed a lot.
They were-
laughed and laughed.
but to them, both this is things they've told me, and I just know, coming to you and having through you a real home, a place, an island, meant so much to them, and could get them through, particularly my mother, the city living, that we will go to Maine, meaning you.
Yes, and I have postcards there tucked into her book to say just that. We're on our way. We'll be there in a couple days.
It was absolutely essential to them to have you, the boat, but also Maine. This was a recognition by them from their earlier time and later on. That a chance. We are living in New York, but we have got to get to a home place, a land, a place of land.
Yeah.
And this was
And I think it was
who you were and what you were to them.
perhaps, I don't know, maybe I'm extrapolating, but I think that now with all of this backdrop that I'm hearing, perhaps it was just an enormous, really they could be who they were and not struggle, not have to, conjure up those those things that were so dire, in their past and relive it for whatever reason. But no, we were just, I don't know, it was a lot about sailing, and there's some great stories, relative to that we think of about George and Mary, and Mary particularly had she had a one-liner, a real zinger to another guy who had a big fancy boat and a neighboring island, but a summer person, and he knew that they were out in this little petite sailboat, and said, "Well, if you ever need any help, you just call me." And Mary looked dead in the eye with her sweet smile and said, "Yes, and you do the same." all that was needed to be said.
Well, I think this reminds me of the close of that beautiful poem ballad where George is recalling the speech of somebody they meet in their sailing adventures, but the line is, what I like best is visiting other islands, and that seems to sum up their whole the whole sort of ethos of this kind of nomadic devotion. Bob, I wonder if you could tell us the story about the binoculars, because this seems like quintessentially Oppen-esque to me.
Yes,
you
it
told
is.
it to me
I
a
do
couple
remember
summers
it.
ago.
And to me, in our family, we had also a pair of these binoculars, which were given to my father as a gift. I have them still, because they were, 750 power and just a very good quality binoculars. And George and Mary also had a pair like this that they carried in that little sailboat. But only one person can look through a pair of binoculars. So they solved that by sawing them in two. So they each had a monocular. They could, I just...
They tore books too. One would read the first part and tear it off and hand it to the other one. Yes, sharing.
Some kind of Solomonic mania. I love it.
I hope it wasn't your binoculars.
No, that was
okay,
theirs.
because it could have been.
And I couldn't unequivocally say that they're not in the attic.
In halves, okay.
There's a lot of things from the boat there.
Yeah.
No, it was...
Yeah, and that's my memory of their sailing too. They had it down to such a science because they had such a tiny space to occupy, and they didn't say much about it, but just you just knew that they had it figured out perfectly for them, and it was perfect for them. And Bob and I would sometimes shake our head, we'd see. They'd be headed offshore somewhere. They had no clue and didn't need to where they were going because the destination was not the thing. It was just, it was the experience. And
they always had some adventure.
Oh, yes.
They might be gone they could be gone for a week or more. And we had no idea where they had gone or what, but we'd find when they come back, I remember once they sailed off and they were over in Camden, and there was a man there who had brought a large, like an oyster dredging boat from the Chesapeake Bay up there, that with the big mast and boom and hoist and to sail freight to islands, and he had some commitment to do this, and they were just tied up alongside of him in Camden Harbor to get supplies or whatever, and he didn't have any crew to do, so they signed on and left their boat and sailed off to the islands with him helping haul this freight out to Manhigan, one of the further islands out, with a load of freight and lumber and whatever, and go back, and a week or so they arrived back at Eagle and telling us about this story and all the fun they'd had and things that happened. And,
Oh, that's fantastic.
yeah, it was.
Their confidence was total. Total. They were usually right.
Yes, they were, yeah.
Yeah, made an adventure out of it, some kind of a way. And they lived on that little boat, you know. As tiny as that was, Mary had made just hammocks, which there was a little shelter on the bow of the boat, which you could get from your head to your waist under cover. And they made these hammocks, and then with the boom and a tarp over it, they could get shelter for the night. But and they got caught in Rockland, which is open to the east and the southeast winds, and in just a foggy, rainy spell, in 3 days they stayed on that boat in that harbor while it blew and rained and whatever before they got out and sailed back home to Eagle. That was their adventure for that trip. Endurance, but they did and came back. Yeah, dried out.
Yeah, they'd blow in on a wind of some kind, out of southwest, coming back from Attendicus, wherever they'd been, and we'd see them coming, or setting out and coming back, and hear the stories.
Linda, I wonder if you could tell us just what did you learn that your father was a poet? What was that like?
A myth has grown up about that, and it's
dispel the myth.
Partly my fault, because it makes a good story to have no idea that but of course I knew the stories of their going to college, however briefly, and being in a poetry class and introduced to each other by their
Jack Lyon. Yeah,
exactly.
right.
And this is a story I knew about, that they both considered themselves, went to college as poets and had published. But the way a kid knows things about parents, and it's in the past, you're not interested.
Right.
And it's not terribly unusual to write poetry when you're young and in love and having these romantic adventures. So even my teenage years, I didn't think much about it, but I certainly knew that. When did I become aware that there was a capital P poet in his life? Probably when he started writing again. And there were a few months in there when he was beginning, and I knew he was writing, and I didn't know what. I certainly wasn't interested. It was during a summer that I had met a bunch of people, and I brought home one group who had been going to the poetry houses around Santa Monica. And one of them was carrying Howl, the Ginsberg book. And my father disappeared with it. And I was vaguely aware of that. And so in hindsight, I knew that was poetry, and that was when, and that was of interest. But he did come back and talk about this. Who is this poet, and what is this poem, to this gang of teenagers.
Right.
Would you say that George was provoked by Howl? That
He
is,
would-
that's a dimension that
Well-
is just
No,
really.
he's mentioned this. This isn't a
Yeah.
secret. This is there that he encountered Powell. That is how, and that's when. It was the summer of '58,
Right,
which is a few months after the famous dream when he starts,
Right, right.
right,
but only a very few months.
right. And he reviews Howell with the
Well, he
McClure and
reviews how
Olson.
a little bit
and that
later with
little-
Olson and
Right, the
McClure,
omnibus review.
Not poets he was destined to adore.
No.
That way. He actually was
Not
pretty
really.
just in that review. It was one review in Poetry Magazine. You can look it up. It's actually now in the Stephen Cope
Right,
edition
the
of
selected prose.
The prose, some of the
Yeah.
prose and the notebooks.
Yeah.
But
That's,
I mean,
But that it was a happenstance, and he was then willing to talk about,
right,
or he was obsessed with what he was doing. He mostly disappeared, but I was busy with the last year's high school and going off to college.
of course, yeah,
Didn't pay much attention.
yeah.
They came up to visit me. This is now only a couple months later.
When you were at Sarah Lawrence?
November, Thanksgiving at Sarah Lawrence, and he is there, and he is a poet, capital letters.
Right, We're publishing with New Directions at that point.
Well,
Or- Was that
talking
not
about,
yet?
or
Yeah.
one of the reasons for coming, and I'd been sent to look up Louis Zukowski and Resi, and I was sent ahead again.
Oh, you were the advanced scout. Okay, yeah.
So that these connections, and I'd known from family album pictures of these people and that they were poets. And so there's a continuity and a discontinuity
Yeah.
about this.
And were you, so when the Pulitzer happens and he's sort of, famously like, not so sure about this. I mean, did you guys talk then, or was there a, any? Well, I mean, he doesn't go in the Pulitzer reading. He's sort of like
He had
bows
a
out of
terrible
the
time.
limelight.
He had a very difficult time reading or appearing in public or presenting himself. I mean, he could be spontaneous and funny, but to come and be arranged and face academics.
Boy.
And I can't be very articulate about it, but I know of his discomfort with fame or institutions.
Yeah.
And if he's gotten the prize, that's it. They've gotten enough of me or something. But also a serious problem, literally, with his voice.
Oh, I was not aware of that.
They went through all kinds of microphones and trying to find things that he could. His throat tightened up. He had a very hard time.
Yeah.
So I think that was what was.
Well, that seems in keeping also with his sort of, solitary character, as that kind of, wanting to protect that in some ways.
He also really wanted to protect the time. It's very bizarre to do a back reading from the onset of Alzheimer's, when really he wasn't writing, because he would often write, again, within the letters, I don't have that much more time, because of course he had the 25-year or the 24-and-a-half-year gap. So he really had another full career in 20 years. He had the 5 years around discrete series of 4 years.
Right.
And then there was this tremendous gap where, in fact, no matter what people say, and I've asked you, and there's been a lot of back and forth, he apparently really did not write. That is, people want him to have had written or something
Yes,
like
we
that,
do.
but
We do.
it appears from all the evidence that can be
He
found.
did not write
that
letters.
He did not write.
He
did
didn't
not.
even sign checks. I mean, he did not write.
Right. Which is itself, really kind of amazing. But referring back to the Pulitzer and all of that, he really didn't want to waste his time towards the end, what was becoming the end of his life.
Yeah.
And that it wasn't like he knew beforehand. That would be crazy to say that. But there was a sense that there are choices, and that's a choice I'm not making. Again, this very existential. He actually broke commitments around the Pulitzer that had been made for him with what he called a bad form letter, which is actually a wonderful pun. He wrote a carbon, many carbons, that were extremely bad form to be doing this. So this is what happened, and it was just, this is not me, and I'm not going to waste my time doing it.
He also really could not shift gears. If he was thinking about something or if he was involved in a project, he wasn't present. You could talk and he'd say yes or no, and it would have no bearing on the question you'd asked him. He was entirely mentally involved in whatever it was that he took on.
And you really get that sense reading the notebooks.
An abstraction that just was
working
total.
Through, yeah.
And if he was thinking the next poem or the next trailer to make, whatever, at the different stages, it was total. And it was one of the luxuries they had, that they could quit the job or could quit the whatever it was they were doing and do what they wanted to do next.
Well,
and they'd always lived that way.
Well, this leads me to a slightly oddball question I've been dying to ask. This partly came out of the dementia that when I was writing my dissertation, but I did partly on your father. But did they ever go to the movies? I mean, did he follow baseball? I mean, what was his relationship to popular culture? They went to the movies.
They read everything. They went to all movies. They went to all art openings. It was maddening to go with them, however, because they were very likely to arrive early or late and leave early or late.
Right.
Walk right through from one room to the museum, right on through the other. And yet afterwards, if they wanted to talk about it, they'd have observed it and judged it and absorbed it and talked about it between themselves. This is always what everything is material for their talk, their conversation. And they would not have missed anything that they didn't want to miss. They would have picked up the things in this amble through, or half the movie. They could give you the essences of it or what they thought of it anyway. It was astonishing.
Well, did he have some favorite movies? I mean, I have this theory that he liked Westerns. I don't know why I developed that.
No,
Right.
that was me, horses.
Scratch that off. All right.
That was me, horses.
Thank you.
No, but I mean the bad side of it in a way was that they had a very fierce judgment. They had very fierce judgment. You did not want to, to be on the wrong side of that judgment. And it's very clear, in a kind of aesthetic, ethical judgment. It's like when George described, I think it's also in the letters, but being so enraged by going on leave into Paris and seeing a Léger exhibit. And Léger, Léger's like an okay artist, whatever, but there was something about, there was a kind of fakeness and probably a kind of fake leftism in Léger, the machine forms and so on, that drove him completely round the bend. Literally, because he had a tremendous capacity for rage, describing this as, I was so enraged that, and that was that sense of a judgment where they could actually amble through, and then that would be finished. There was nothing more in that for them. It was quite an interesting thing, and one respected it tremendously because
you found out they were right.
They were right. I know. That was so great. They were often really totally right. Yeah. And often you learned that later, right? They say, oh no, I really like this, and you're right. I mean, you don't really like this, and they were right. Yeah.
But the judgmental and the anger were very, very constant in themes, and it made it hard. Friendships would rupture over a conversation. Trains of thought would completely stop, and you wouldn't know how or why.
Can you give an example of a friendship that ruptured, or is that a little...
Oh, well, speaking about the movies, in Mexico was when the one about the Juliet of the spirits, but the earlier one.
Knights of Camelia?
La Scala.
La Strada.
La Strada. I knew
Okay.
I wasn't quite there
That's the
on that.
Fellini movie, 1954.
Very, very close friendship. Terribly important to me with some of the movie people, particularly with Jean and Hugo Butler. And a conversation that they had. I wasn't present. This I've been told from all the participants at different times. My parents made some statement to Hugo and Jean, who were movie. They knew and they understood the craft and the importance.
Blacklisted screenwriters, right?
And how important. You could judge had the movie making of this, the breakthrough and the importance and what mattered and how it was really that. But my parents had made one of those. No, this is not. And it was the end of the friendship,
Wow.
of an enormous, important friendship that mattered hugely through years of support and mutual help and child raising and adventures and wonderful hilarity. Hugo was as funny as my father. It was just magnificent. And this is the end.
Yeah.
That's
Do
it.
you remember
yeah.
why the particular terms of why they didn't like La Strada and why the Hugo did, or?
Oh, I think for Hugo, and I'm just supplying this, and I've spoken to Jean about it, it was the amazing newness to the movie making, the cinematic, the technical,
Right.
something which my parents would have dismissed as not what they were interested in.
Yeah.
So across some kind of aesthetic line.
And the aesthetic line with
Wrongly,
Leger and
yeah.
with this is if it verges on the commercial or the graphic or the... It's not popular that they didn't
It's a
mind.
kind of packagedness.
As something like
Right.
graphic arts or commercial arts in the old term in school, I think that was
Yeah.
what it was, a slickness.
Slickness,
Right.
right,
Slickness,
right.
yeah.
right.
Well, and it's amazing too, because it's hard now, I think, to think that
This
friendships
breaks-
could end over,
Oh.
but there was a time when that was serious and lines were drawn, and now in the age of,
If my
I don't
parents
know.
were alive, it would still be the way it was done.
Right.
well,
Yes.
good to see that some standards are still being upheld. It's 7 o'clock, and I wonder, this has been wonderful, but I wonder if maybe we could throw this open to some people in the audience who have questions, and Chloe will come around with a microphone, so if you have a question for anybody here, raise your hand or a comment or your own memory.
There are a couple of people here.
There are
who have
people here
memories.
who do
Lee,
have memories
Lee,
of
Bob.
them, yes.
Yeah,
Give people a minute.
yeah, right over here.
Can I ask you about your mother's poetry? I read it. Montemora, was it called It was published by Montemora.
Transpositions is your thing.
Yes, transpositions.
No,
Yeah.
And there's a line in it that meant a great deal to me. We enter, and it is our home. And I don't know. I never heard anyone really. I never heard your mother read, and I regret that. But I just wonder how she held poetry and what was the relationship like when she was writing.
I knew them so intensely as people and parents, which is different from people. That I don't trust myself to answer about the poetry and what was in their public mind. But Rachel's here.
Well, something that's always interested me about the way that Mary was, she was a doer, I mean, as I've said, to several people, she would be the person that if you had appendicitis, you'd submit to her with a rusty knife because she could take it out. There's no doubt, absolutely unbelievable woman. And the thing that she liked to do one thing at a time, and she did it well, and then she didn't do it anymore.
Yeah.
So there's a pattern with the artwork. She would master medium, photography, printmaking, a lithograph, I think.
Various kinds of
various kinds
etchings.
of etchings.
Yeah.
Collage at the end of her life, painting, memoir writing, this one memoir, poetry. She did it all. I mean, I don't think she did sculpture, but I mean, it
yes,
gives
she
you
did.
the idea,
She
that
did.
she went,
Yes.
she went into this
Yeah.
a field, and she decided that she would do it, and then she didn't do it anymore. That's always been very fascinating to me.
Right.
I don't have a good explanation. It wasn't because there was no resonance in, people liked the work, whatever it was. They liked the etchings, they liked the collage, they liked the poetry, they liked the memoir, and when it was done, it was done. It was the page was folded, it was turned. I have no explanation for this except there was a desire for mastery and for going on to the next thing. I'm testing.
It wasn't done for someone else. It was
That's
the
right.
extent to which she was interested and curious about it or challenged by it. And then
Yes,
it was
that-
something else. Yeah.
And then it was something else. And it looks sort of like flighty, if you want to. I mean, there are different ways of judging that negatively. It was not as if she was not encouraged by, in fact, by George, if that's, you know, if that's the hidden question. There was no doubt that there wasn't an issue between them that she was writing poetry suddenly or whatever. It was just that she wanted to test things out and do them well, and then go on to the next thing.
Oh, I can do that, she would say to
Yes,
herself, and
I
that was
can
it.
do that. Right. And she did remarkable work. I mean, one of the most remarkable, at the end of her life, she did collage, which were sort of representational, and she did the most amazing one of Oppen, of George, that is on the cover
right.
of the Ironwood.
The Ironwood,
It is
yeah.
uncanny how good it is.
Yeah. And it was her first collage.
That's what I mean. That's what I mean.
Impressive.
She just mastered it. Things. She was very quick. They were both very quick.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we've got a question in the back. Hang on to the mic, gets over there, if you would, please. All right.
Thanks. I have two kind of unrelated questions. So I wish I'd bothered to read before I came here the exact lines, but it's basically the privileged find everything already there, and it's basically about I think his like experience with being upper class, or how he like felt about that, and he says that life is a game, life is like baseball to them or something. And again, I'm sorry, I don't have the exact poem.
Yeah.
I do have the selected poems right in here, but
No, I know that.
do you know what I'm talking about?
This in which?
Yeah, I was
Trying
wondering what
I
his
have
relationship to,
reflected.
I guess, privilege or money was. And the other thing, which is totally unrelated, is what kind of things did he find funny? What did he laugh at?
Life. The human condition. His, just to slide off on that, something that I don't think has come up. He had the most remarkable hyperactive compassion, a humanitarianism. The politics came out of this. He could not stand it when he saw people starving in the Depression. And it was a desperate search. Who is helping? How can I get people fed? My mother would have fed them. I mean, she would have cooked and fed them. But my father had to find some means. There was a larger system when people were suffering. How he could solve this problem, he could lead them. And it could be, we've mentioned all the animals. I had a lot of pets. Anything that could conceivably be left loose was. He couldn't bear them to be in a cage or tethered. He would identify and just be desperate. Somebody once told me a story of throwing a stick for a dog, and the dog in the ocean, and the dog wasn't quite getting it. And my father got up, fully dressed, and got the stick and handed it to the dog and walked back to the beach.
Amazing story. That is absolutely.
And this
very-
is typical.
It's
Typical.
also-
Nobody would
it's
say
both-
anything, nor would he expect it to be.
It's both very funny and very deep, actually,
Yeah.
that story. It's
And it's from somebody who told it or wrote it or something. But I've seen things like that, where he would rescue. And the opposite of that is people of privilege who are ignoring the condition of ordinary people, or not feeling it, or in spite of their other people's needs. And his very rich family was and his very rich half-sister was a desperate embarrassment.
You're talking about
And-
June now.
And a deep attachment that he couldn't break, so ambivalence beyond talking about.
Right. But they were on friendly terms. He and
Oh, it
June.
was a bond that was not breakable.
Right, but still there was-
Sometimes it was intolerable for either of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
right. June is another story. I think I know the part that you mean, but I'm trying to find it.
I couldn't find it
It's
either,
it's
but
in Of Being
rings a bell.
Numerous.
Yeah.
I think it's in Of Being Numerous. Yeah, yeah. They develop argument in order to speak. They become unreal. Life loses solidity, loses extent. Baseball's their game, because baseball is not a game, but an argument and difference of opinion makes the horse races. They are ghosts that endanger one's soul. So he wasn't, this is a comment, it's using baseball as a metaphor for another kind of political comment. And that's in section 13 of being numerous. It may also be in another language of New York. But anyway, that's what you're referring to. I don't, whether that answers the question, I don't know. It seems to raise more questions than it answers in many ways.
Yeah, we've got Ruth back there, and then a person over here. So,
Yeah, thank you. It's very moving to be here. And I was actually, when I was getting ready to come to this, I had the most extraordinary memory of reading Oppen when I was living in Ohio in 1978, and I had read him 10 years before that, but I was reading him again and tried to review his collected poems, and all of a sudden I could feel the pieces of paper from that book that I was reading, because I've always been so struck by his tone and his mastery of tone. And I show his poems to my students whenever I talk about consistency of tone and seriousness of tone. And you mentioned clarity as the fundamental thing to him, and I wonder if anybody wanted to comment on the relationship between the two or say anything more about tone in his work.
Go.
I could do it. I could try to do something. I would say that actually, in contrast, that there's a tremendous vectoring in his work. As soon as which for me is symbolized by these incredible pivoting line breaks, where he actually breaks phrases in the middle. That's why when I read that, I had trouble reading it, because you don't know where one phrase ends and the other one begins. And often that phrase, when he does that, he's changing in the middle of a line, where the line can have one meaning if you read the line as a line, but as soon as you slop over, and called enjambment in technical term, as soon as you move it to that next line, something happens where it actually changes the meaning or adds a dimension of the meaning. So while his tone may be serious and he seeks clarity, the clarity leads to this incredible vectoring and shifting of almost the terms on which you're standing. So one's impression of reading an Oppen poem sometimes is that's where the C comes in for me, the vectors. You're always sailing this way and that way to get to the place where you're going. That would be the first kind of comment, but I'm not going to make any more right now.
Somebody asked about what they found funny, and I just realized I didn't answer that.
Okay.
Pogo.
Right.
I can see that.
Was
Kelly's
an
pogo.
essential theme through all the years. He was anti-establishment. He was kind of leftist. It was
We have met the enemy, and he is us.
There were code words through in it that the left responded to, and this is a challenge to all of you. There's a lot of quotes from Pogo scattered through his works.
Oh my God! Now you tell me.
Now you tell us. It's tremendous.
But you could say Pogo and the whole family would fall on the floor laughing. I mean, so.
Did you guys like schmooze?
Schmooze earlier, but
Pogo was
Kelly, what Walt Kelly could do with drawing or with
Yeah.
these complicated.
Yes.
One of his phrases from
perfect.
Pogo, and it does come up in the letters frequently,
Right.
is "There's nobody here but us chickens."
Right.
That's
Right,
Pogo.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's in of being numerous, in effect.
That's right.
something.
Yeah.
Oh,
That's brilliant.
now a new research topic. Right.
I think. We have a question over here, Chloe. Just wait for the mic. Thanks.
Yeah, I just wondered if there was something in particular that triggered his starting to write again after those 24 years.
That's the mystery, isn't it? Yeah.
You don't.
And I think it's more interesting why he started than why he stopped. I think I know why he stopped. I think it's fully documented. I believe them. It's consistent with their life. The starting again is remarkable, that there was this poet who had grown up in the meantime and started again. But he always retold the story of he was ready, or the next poem was coming. No, I can't be more helpful than that. But it is a remarkable fact and mystery.
Yeah, there is, he told the story about the rust and copper dream,
Right.
et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll retell it, but it still is there's a deeper mystery to it. So I'm
Yeah,
not
I think
really
so.
answering the question. At one point they're pretty depressed by the end of the Mexico thing years, and they were both working with a psychologist,
I was
some-
sent to a psychiatrist because there were problems in the family.
Okay,
The psychiatrist said, "Let me meet your parents."
Okay, okay. Let me meet your parents. Right. Okay. And somehow triggered by the empathy of this man, or the fact that they
Just the fact that he was going to have to go in to see him. It was on his way to the first visit that
he
he had this
apparently
dream.
at one point dreamed this famous that he tells, so it's a fixed story. Okay, rust in copper dream, and it was comic dream that was involved with both June, his half sister, and his father.
Right.
His father had left papers that says how to prevent rust in copper, but the joke that was in the dream was, but copper doesn't rust. So. In the beginning of the letter, in the edition of the letters, I kind of try to decode the copper and the Oppen and the Papa and the
Right.
all of those kinds of things that might be
Punning,
punning metonymies and stacks of material. But what he says, and it's actually there are two different stories at this point. And then I got a piece of paper and a pencil, and I went home and started writing. Or the other alternative story is, 2 years later, I started writing, and there are two different dates given for this. So, which leads to Linda's more intelligent remark. There is still a very big mystery about why. I think his father died at some point. You were going off to college, and that was a known fact. So, you were no longer an excuse. I've talked about that. Protecting. There was also a fear of saying what he needed to say, and then finally. That was overcome, and that is still a mystery of why.
And at about the same time, correct me if I'm wrong, but they were removed from the FBI's watch list, and they could get their passports
They got a passport
renewed.
back.
They could get entry back into the United States, and I think that must have triggered something as well.
Right.
This is all happening.
Right.
That they were
roughly
going
at
to
the
come
same
back
time.
to New
Right.
York, which means a life as a poet.
Right,
Right.
Yeah.
right.
That's what New York meant to them, and
Right.
it happened then, was going to happen.
Yeah.
And it was the first time they could return, was right at
Right.
those same years.
Yeah.
There have to be
Anybody
other-
else?
Dan.
Dan, we have hang on for the mic, Dan.
Linda, what were your impressions of Reznikov and Zhukovsky and whoever else you may have met when you were sent to meet them? You must have been 18 or so.
Resi was
And
wonderful.
did you know them later through the years?
Resi was wonderful. Immediately invited me to lunch or dinner or whatever at the 14th Street Automat. Not another automat. This one was best for whatever it was best
He was a
for.
connoisseur of automats, wasn't
And
he? Yes.
the next date was at the 35th Street Automat. I don't know, which was not comparable. And he was funny and cute, and one adored him. And then my parents came and took over the friendship, and I didn't have anything further. The Zhukovskys were famously difficult.
Yes.
I came to meet them, and not quite sure what or why, and I was going to be in college and all of this. And they gave me cookies or whatever would be normal, and handed me a sheaf of manuscript to type and return the next day. In 10 copies.
Get out.
On
Wow.
these old typewriters. So I didn't go again. I did the typing and turned it in, and a long trip from Sarah Lawrence by triple subway or something, and delivered the 10 copies by carbon copies, and of course
Good
didn't call
God.
again.
Do you remember what it was, even to?
It must have been part of A.
It was part of A.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
well, it was in 10 copies, so it got to be quite a bit. I don't know if I even told him. I just said I wasn't, he's yours.
Good call.
Yeah.
Oh, my word.
Absolutely unbelievable story.
Yeah.
I liked Paul. He was sort of on the son, who was sort of on the edges. And I did go to I don't know if I was even by direct invitation, but I knew about it, to his Carnegie Hall debut, and it was amazing. This young, scrawny kid playing the most extreme modern banging, you know, bouncing and the violin going. I'd never seen such a thing.
Wow.
But I haven't seen them or anything further.
Yeah. I think Paul is in Israel now. I'm not sure, but anybody else have any
Questions or memories?
questions? Well, I think, you know, let's just give a warm round of applause to everybody.
I want to say thank you, and I want to join you in thanks, because I don't think my parents, in their peremptory manner, ever said to Rachel, thank you.
Oh, it was love.
True, but without your letters, the amazing scholarship and the work of gathering your letters, and without your pushing, I push too, but without your pushing, meaning would not have been written. And without those 2 volumes, his poetry wouldn't be understandable, or the full meaning of it couldn't be found by others. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.